the title of that song was Dance Apocalyptic, and the title of this talk is Life Apocalyptic. And, you know, it seems very, very dramatic and so forth, but I mean that in like the most literal sense possible, right? That the apocalypse is here, we're already living in it, and we've got to figure out what to do about it. So I want to start by talking about mass extinction events. The agreed upon definition of a mass extinction event is the extinction of 75% of all Earth species within a period of 2 million years. And so far in Earth's history, we have had 5 mass extinction events. The last one occurred when an asteroid, which is estimated to be like 6 to 9 kilometers across, that would be about, I don't know, 4 to 7 miles across. Asteroid of that size hit the Yucatan Peninsula about 65 million years ago, and that's the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, right? And it's also the most rapid mass extinction on record, as you might expect from such a dramatic event, right? Asteroid hits Earth, right? But this dramatically rapid mass extinction event still took 32,000 years, right? So it's not as if the asteroid hit and 5 days later the dinosaurs were gone, right? 32,000 years, so that's what, you know, 10 times the length of recorded history or something like that. Let's compare where we stand now to those previous mass extinction events. And by the way, all the data I'm using here comes from ourworldanddata.org /extinctions, and you can find this data as easily as I did. So these are all estimates, but recent extinction rates are at least 100 and maybe 1,000 times higher than the natural background rate of extinction. And since 1500, species have been going extinct faster than they did during the Cretaceous mass extinction 65 million years ago, right? So if you measure the 500 years or so since 1500, the lowest class of animals in terms of, you know, the animals that are doing best in terms of extinction are reptiles, but they are still going extinct at 4 times the rate of the Cretaceous event. And mammals since 1500 have been going extinct at 81 times the Cretaceous event. Since 1980, right, it's been even faster. So reptiles are now going extinct at 16 times the rate of the fastest mass extinction in history. And amphibians are going extinct at a rate 165 times faster than the Cretaceous mass extinction. So at those rates, how long is it going to take before we are actually in mass extinction territory, right? Well, if we take critically endangered species, right? Critically endangered species are those estimated to have a 50% chance of going extinct within 10 years, right? Well, let's assume that all critically endangered species, right, the ones that have a 50% chance of going extinct within 10 years, let's assume that they all go extinct within 100 years, right? And extrapolating from that, how long would it take to reach 75% species lost? The answer for birds is 2,265 years, mammals, 1,519 years, amphibians, 890 years. In other words, what's happening right now is species lost at a rate over 10 times as fast as the mass extinction event that caused, 2,000 years, the extinction of the dinosaurs, right? So 32,000 years that time. And the most long-lived of these species, the birds, are given currently 2,265 years, right? Now, there is good news, right? The good news is that we're not yet in mass extinction territory. And we're not even close to losing 75% of species. But we are on a path towards a sixth great extinction, and we're moving toward it much faster than the 5 previous great extinctions. Right? Now, one reaction to that might be, so what? Right? So I want to address that. Right? It's like, okay, so species are going extinct. I'm sad about that maybe, but I don't really see what it has to do with me. So one question is, even from a point of view of your own attachment to humans and other species, right? I mean, are humans really the only species that matters to you? I hope that's a rhetorical question. Species extinction undermines ecological balances that sustain all life. And while we may not be able to predict precise effects of a mass extinction effect on humans, we can say with a high degree of certainty that it is going to disrupt ecosystems in a major way, and that humans will be seriously affected by that. And let me put the point as sharply as I can, right? If we are in fact on a path to extinction of 75% of species within a couple of millennia, how do we know that humans are going to be one of the species that survives? And to make that question even more threatening, I want to talk about several of the ways human life is currently endangered, right? And of course, you sort of think about it, and it's, top of the list is global warming. We all know about it. We've all heard about it, but it's certainly not the only problem out there, right? We also have a major problem of soil degradation, water degradation, air degradation. All of those are killing people right now. A few weeks ago, I read a paper by a very conservative University of Chicago economist who estimates that, air pollution alone kills 3 million people every year, year in, year out. We also have heavy exposure to heavy metals, petrochemicals, and other industrial disease-causing substances. In some cases, those exposures are so massive that places are even named after it. So in Louisiana, sort of the I-10 corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is routinely referred to as Cancer Alley, because the heavy concentration of petrochemical plants has led to really elevated cancer rates there. When I was young, I can remember when I was riding in the car with my parents for any length of time, the same thing always happened. There would be, easily within 100 miles, dozens, if not of hundreds, of insects who have died because they smashed up against the car windshield. And that doesn't happen anymore. And the reason is that there's been a massive decline in insect population, including the collapses of bee colonies that you probably read about a few years ago. And if bees collapse, we all die within 4 years, right? No pollination, we're just done, right? What else do we have coming up? We've got overuse of antibiotics for decades now, partly in humans, and that's getting better, but more importantly in livestock, right? Livestock are now raised in such filthy conditions that their feed is just routinely laced with megadoses of antibiotics. That, of course, is a recipe for creating new kinds of bacteria that are immune to the antibiotics that we currently have. And right now we're losing that race. Of course, you know about the problem of release of new diseases into the human population, right? We've all lived through COVID. But think about AIDS before that. Think about Ebola, which, is not as threatening, but it's certainly very, very scary. And think about the transmission of flu from birds to humans, which is something that happens. And in 2006, we barely missed a major outbreak of avian flu. And right now we are in the beginning phases of another outbreak of avian flu. And I haven't even mentioned the oceans, right? I mean, the sort of great plastic patch of the Pacific Ocean that we all think about, but more broadly, acidification of the oceans, the loss of coral reefs, which are key to ocean ecosystems, as well as loss of oxygen within the oceans, which means die-offs of species that live there. So we've got all of these problems, and several of them are serious enough that just they alone could wipe out the bulk of human population on the planet. So are we going to be able to fix this, right? And I'm going to narrow the focus here just to global warming, because that's where the most research has been done, and also it's the area I know best. The figures I'm going to give you here are based on a report by Simon Michaud for the Geographical Survey of Finland. It's like an 80 megabyte file because it's a 1,000-page report with lots of color graphics in it. So I probably can't email it to you, but if anybody is interested in it, shoot me an email, and I can give you at least the URL where you can download it for yourself. Right? So here's the basic problem, right? If we're going to end global warming, we have to stop burning fossil fuels, right? And to do that, we're going to need renewables, not just to replace the power that's currently generated by fossil fuels, but also the power that will be needed to produce electric vehicles, storage batteries, solar arrays, wind power stations, new nuclear power plants, et cetera, et cetera. So this huge report tries to take all of that into account, and comes to the conclusion that if we really want to replace all fossil fuel with non-fossil resources, here's what we would need. 834 new nuclear power plants, 12,504 new dams, 63,445 new wind power stations, 69,573 new solar power stations, 74,628 new biowaste power facilities, and 609 geothermal, tidal power, and miscellaneous facilities. Right? No one is proposing spending money on the scale it would take to actually do that. And until we start spending that money, you'll know that the people talking about doing something are not serious, because they're not actually addressing the problem. They're not taking an obvious necessary step to solve the problem. But in addition to inadequate funding, here are some other barriers to getting to that point. Not enough time, right? We are on a short clock here, and construction and engineering project of this scale is going to take a very long time. Don't know exactly how long, but it's going to be, difficult at best. Not enough minerals, right? Where's the lithium going to come from? Where's the cobalt going to come from, right? And even if we can get them, we need to do some hard thinking about exactly how minerals are gotten in this global economy. Solar and wind power are intermittent. That's not something that means they're completely out of the question as fuel sources, but it's a problem that has to be addressed. Not enough sites for new hydropower plants. In addition, for using fossil fuels for fuel, those same raw oil is used also in agriculture, fertilizers, industry, plastics. So we have to think about doing that as well as the energy side of the equation. And then finally, we've got increased energy demand through population growth and or economic growth. Right? Now, let's imagine, right, that all of these technological barriers could be overcome, right? Uh, to make it happen, we would need a spending commitment, probably on the scale of the Second World War, right? And during the Second World War, the United States was literally, had a deficit that was larger than the whole size of the civilian economy, right? We just converted everything to a military economy, and we did it very, very fast. That's what we'd have to try and do again. Keep your eyes open. Let me know if you ever see it happening, right? But remember, that's just one of the threats, right? Can you imagine us not just doing this for global warming, but doing them for all 10 of those threats simultaneously, as well as any I forgot, because no doubt I forgot some. So what does the future look like? Surprise, surprise, all 10 of the problems listed above are going to get worse, not better. Right now, we're in sort of phase one of this crisis. We are like the proverbial boiling frogs, put a frog in a pot of water, turn the heat on under it, and gradually, because the heat rises slowly, the frog will be cooked, right? So we've got all of this going on simultaneously, but it's happening gradually. It's not perceptible in the moment. We know that it's going to be disastrous over the long term. In addition, we have drastic but short-term catastrophes, right? Hurricanes and other extreme weather events, fires, droughts, heat waves, and so forth. But it's not long before we're going to be moving into the second phase, where we are looking at drastic permanent changes. These will include coastal inundation. They will include fresh water loss. The Colorado River, for example, is already inadequate for the demand posed on it by the US West. If you've been in my class, you've probably heard me talk sometime about the nightmare scenario where the glaciers in the Himalayan mountains melt, and the Asian rivers that provide water for about 3 billion people go dry after they flood for 20 years, right? While the glaciers are melting, you get floods, then you get dry rivers, right? And these are rivers with names like Ganges and Mekong and Yangtze, right? These are not small rivers. And then, right, initially due to wet bulb temperatures that are going to go up to the point where people just can't live in certain places anymore, but not only due to that, we're going to have permanent climate refugees in the world as more and more of the Earth's land surface becomes uninhabitable. Now, how are the powers that be going to contrive to do nothing while all of this is going on? Here's how it's going to happen, right? First is denial, and that's been for the last 40 years, right? We know now that by the late 1970s, Exxon's own scientists had already told Exxon exactly where this was going to go, how bad it was going to be, and Exxon, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, funded climate denial, knowing very well they were lying. We've certainly got past that, but now we're in the second phase, which I would call greenwashing, right? Pretending to do something while not doing it. So take the current slogan that you hear, right? Net zero by 2050, right? First of all, net zero doesn't mean zero, right? Net zero means, well, we're still producing fossil fuel pollution, but we're doing something else as well, and we're going to say that it balances out, right? And the second is by 2050, which is really, really soon, right? Except if you're a politician. And by 2050, if you're a politician, means that's somebody else's problem. And then finally, when things get too bad to do nothing, we will be told that it's too late to do what we could have done earlier, and our only remaining option is geoengineering. And there have been lots of geoengineering schemes proposed. Probably the best known one is, hey, let's fill the Earth's atmosphere with aerosols to counterbalance the greenhouse gases. This, of course, is not well planned for. It's just like, well, we're making things up that we might do one day, right? The other one that's talked about all the time is carbon sequestration. And basically, carbon sequestration would allow fossil fuel companies to use their pipelines to sequester the carbon back in the wells that they dug to get the fossil fuels out, right? So if it's geoengineering, gee, who has really large engineering and building capacities? Guess what? It's the fossil fuel industry. They'll make money both ways. Now, the two big solutions that have been proposed to climate change, right, are degrowth and the Green New Deal. Degrowth makes a very good point, which is we just can't keep growing, right? Eventually, no matter what we do, just the heat released from energy production alone is going to bake the planet. So we've got to figure out sooner rather than later how not to have a growing economy, right? And, you know, ecological economists have been arguing this for 50 years or so. But degrowth alone is not going to do it, because 80% of our energy worldwide is still produced by fossil fuels. That would mean cutting, if we're seriously going to address this through degrowth and just decommission fossil fuel generation, right, tomorrow, yeah, you would probably also have an 80% contraction in economic activity, because we have made no plans for how economic activity would continue in the absence of the fossil fuels that we now use, right? So the proponents of the Green New Deal say, well, okay, you know, in the long run, you know, we won't argue, but what we have to do right now is build the infrastructure that makes degrowth possible later, right? But as we've seen, right, the scale of that infrastructure spending is so large that it's not even been proposed in a legislature seriously, and you know, it's probably not going to happen. So we have two solutions that keep getting bandied about by people of goodwill, and as far as I can tell, neither of them is going to get us far enough to really address the problem. So obviously at this point, we have to ask Lenin's question, right? What is to be done? There are some things that we do that you would have to say are necessary, and you know, we should keep doing them, but they're really half measures, right? And these would include things like, you know, vote for the best politicians. Well, okay, we'll vote for the best politicians, but you know, we've been doing that for a long time, and look where we are. We could, you know, put more money into lobbying for the policies we want, and okay, we could do that, but are we ever going to win against the oil companies at that game? I mean, that's their game. That's not our game, right? Well, what if we say, okay, so protests, we'll do protests. You know, at this point, protests are basically performative, right? There have been lots and lots of protests, some of them on a really massive scale. And, you know, good words are said and people do their bit and feel good about doing that, and quite rightly. And then people go home and nothing has changed. Yeah. Well, what if we sort of upped it a little bit more, right? What if we moved to mass civil disobedience as well as protests? Um, that might do something, depending on how it's done. But civil disobedience can also become basically performative. Right? For example, does anyone besides me in this room know that about 2 weeks ago, 100 climate scientists worldwide committed civil disobedience to protest climate change? Yeah? Jolie, you know about it. Okay. Anyone else raise your hand? Yeah, okay. So, and I tell you, I wouldn't have known about it, except that one of them is Peter Kalmus, and I follow him on Twitter. So I just happened to learn about it because it's like, oh, it's in his Twitter feed. One thing that's being done now, I want to single out as providing a way forward, even though I'm not going to suggest that it's enough on its own. The water protectors and land defenders who have sort of gone out and tried to physically block extension of fossil fuel infrastructure. Yeah. They have done more to actually stop the expansion of that infrastructure, right, in a very direct way than everything else put together, as far as I can tell. Yeah. And surprise, surprise, they're always met with violence. Yeah. Between, well, think about Keystone XL, the Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, what was going on there, right? I mean, it was indigenous peoples from North America trying to stop a pipeline, and who's against them, right? Big oil companies and entirely non-indigenous police forces, right? Who are quite happy to just roll right over them. Now, you might say, well, let's just do all of the above, right? And okay, so let's. But just doing all of the above doesn't mean that we're going to win, right? So let's think about the kinds of strategic choices that we would need to make in order to actually get somewhere. And first, I think we have to realize that no one is coming to save us, right? The politicians are not going to suddenly become sane, right? The oil companies are not going to suddenly become altruists. If anything is going to be done, it's going to be done by us, right? Where us means ordinary people without a lot of individual power. Second, the only way to not despair is to get rid of all or nothing thinking, right? So all or nothing thinking would be like, well, either we stop it or it happens, right? And no one can stop it, right? No one can stop it because it's already here. And further warming of the Earth's atmosphere is already baked in, to use a really, really bad pun. The carbon that we've already put in the atmosphere will continue to trap solar heat and continue to warm the Earth. For how long does CO2 last in the atmosphere? About 100 years. So we've got a century of warming ahead of us, even if we stopped right now. But, right, this is not an all or nothing proposition, right? We can think of this as everything's fine or the planet blows up. Well, those aren't the options, right? The planet is not fine. People are especially not fine on the planet, but everything we do makes a difference, right? It makes a really, really small difference. Okay? And then third, in terms of sort of mental adjustment, we have to, like, every day sort of face our own grim reality, because it's really, really tempting to just sort of think about something else, right? And the grim reality is the world really is coming to an end, right? Not in the sense that the planet Earth is no longer going to support life of any form, right? But in the sense that we're on the path of a mass extinction, and mass extinctions are the end of a world, right? The world that comes out of a mass extinction is fundamentally different from the world that came before. And with that facing all of us, right? The option of pretending everything is fine and just planning to, live out your days within a system that you assume is stable, well, that's foolishness, right? Everything that you're preparing to do based on the assumption that things in 20 years will be like they are now is wrong, right? We've already seen what's happening. We're already facing consequences from it, and the problem is going to accelerate, right? We have just barely begun to feel this, and we need to know that, and we need to remind ourselves of that every day. Okay. Now, I've used the first person plural a lot, right? But it's hard to place much trust in the first person plural, right? We, us, when we live in a culture that is so individualistic. And here I'm going to drop in a quote from Mariam Kaba's father that some of you may have heard before. Everything worthwhile is done with other people. If you don't know Mariam Kaba, you need to know Mariam Kaba. She was in Chicago for many years. She lives in New York now. She's like one of the most important abolitionists in the United States today. So if you are an individualist, right, I'm just going to do my thing and I'm going to build up, my skills and my human capital and my network and whatever else it takes to be successful. If that's the way you're living, then that little, say, non-despair thing I told you before, every little bit helps. Well, that's not going to seem like very much, right? But if you're a communalist, right, that is every little bit helps, right? That means that the little bit I contribute to my collective helps, and that together, those collectives that we are in community with, we will do even more, right? So when as a sort of starting assumption, it's not just about me, and it's not just me doing this, right? Once you really know that, then every little bit helps doesn't seem so much like false hope. But since no one is coming to save us, right? And since as individualists, we're not going to be able to do what we need to do, right? How do we break out of this way that we've been trained to be? Well, one thing I think is to recognize that no one in reality is really an individualist, right? People may like to pretend that they are, right? But everybody knows that, the good things that have come to us in our life, if any have, right, have come because in part of things other people did, right? And so, for example, I could not have afforded to go to grad school with my own money or my family's money. No one in my family had ever gone to college before me. And if no one, had looked at my application and said, not only will we admit you, we'll also give you full funding and a stipend, I wouldn't be here today, right? So if I say, God damn it, I worked hard in grad school and I earned everything I got, it's like, really? I mean, really, you look over your life and that's all you can say for yourself? Everything was me all along? I mean, A, it's not true. B, it's kind of pathetic, right? So what do you do to break out of this? And I think the place to start is with the question, who are my people going to be, right? And I'm talking about people that you have a real connection to, right? We're not talking about an imagined community or people with whom you have an ideological affinity, right? Now, in some cases, you may decide that you want your people to be people you don't yet have a connection with, and that's okay. But then you have to realize that first you have to build the connection, right? You can't just come blundering in to a group and say, hey, I've got great ideas. Let's do things my way, right? I mean, what is that? That's not going to work, right? So question one, who are my people going to be? Second question, what kinds of solidarity am I able and willing to extend to my people? And what kinds of solidarity would I like to receive from my people? And then, right, once that form of mutual solidarity is up and running, it's time to look around at other communities and ask, okay, so which of these communities are we able and willing to provide solidarity to? And which would we like to provide solidarity to us, right? And once again, building connection with those communities before you just come in saying, hi, we're here to help and we have great ideas, right? That first step of building connection is really important. Now, quick aside, I'm presenting all of this as if you could make everything come off smoothly by following this nice linear path. And I'm really aware that in my life and in everybody's life I know, you don't really have the choice to do things in a nice orderly fashion, right? Shit happens. And sometimes you have to jump in before you're really ready. Or sometimes you want to do something and you just don't have the capacity to do it. Or sometimes, you have to sort of like skip steps because it's an emergency and it seems like you just have to, right? Now, all of this, right? I wouldn't yet call it a strategy for action, right? At best, this is a strategy for developing our capacity to act collectively, right? We've got to get out of the, we're all going to get together and we're all going to put our voices together and we're going to change everything and it's all going to happen this week, right? No, that's not how change happens. And if you want to contribute to change, you have to build capacities to contribute to change, right? You can't just do it based on the assumption that everybody knows how to do this. Making change is hard and most people don't know how to do it. So what would a strategy look like? And here I'm going to be borrowing heavily from a scheme that was put together by Eric Olin Wright, University of Wisconsin sociologist who died a few years ago. I checked today, though, he's got a really great faculty homepage with many, many kinds of resources on it. And even though he's been dead a few years, it's still up. So if you ever have a chance, go and Google Eric Olin Wright, find his faculty homepage and just wander around. It's a good time. Well, it's a good time if you're like me, right, and love books. So you're not going to be surprised to hear me say that just working within the system, right, doing that and nothing else is only going to prolong the agony, right? And so far, our activism has focused on neutralizing harms, right? Either through reformist politics, this is what Wright would call trying to tame the system. So, what would be an example of this, right? Electing the squad, AOC, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley. I think those are all 6 members of the squad, and they support all of this and they're on our side and great. But, 6 out of 435 in the House of Representatives and no squad senators, right? That has been supplemented with militant on the ground opposition, such as Keystone XL or the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is what Wright would call resisting the system. There's also a strategy he calls escaping the system, and that is figuring out different ways to live within the confines of the system that you're stuck with. So, you know, go start a commune, right? You're trying to escape the system. Now, you don't really think that you're going to escape the system, right? You're not really moving out. What you're really doing is modeling new solutions and providing enhanced practical capacities, right? Then fourth, right, what Wright calls dismantling the system. And here he's talking about fundamental change, but change that takes place one piece at a time. Andre Gorz, French social thinker, once called this kind of thing non-reformist reforms, right? That is, reforms that strategically push towards even more profound changes. And, you know, if you want an example of this in action, the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, when it was in power for 40 years without a break, it had an actual plan for real socialism, really transferring the means of production to society as a whole. And they almost got there, not quite, right? They started losing some elections and never got back, but they were just like, oh, so close, right? And then finally, right, number 5, smashing the system, right? And here we are talking about something, you know, dramatic, right? We're talking about Russian Revolution territory here, right? Storm the Winter Palace, depose the Tsar, right? Institute communism. I'm not saying instituting communism is the solution here. I'm just saying it has to be something that dramatic, right? You know, that's our long-term goal, but this kind of goal can't be too long-term because we don't have much time, right? Now, you might object, and you'd be absolutely right, that this talk of smashing the system, right? That it's mere romanticism, right? If you don't get to that place through taming, resisting, escaping, and dismantling the system, right? And yes, we need to do them all at once, which doesn't mean that one person has to do all at once, right? Again, this is we in the strong sense of a collective subject, right? And, you know, just smashing the system, even if you can do it, right? I mean, that's not enough because you also need a program for the revolution, right? If you're going to smash the system, you're going to smash it, and then what? So, final word or words. 1, the question is not whether the system we currently live in is going to survive. It won't. 2, the question is whether the system is going to crash chaotically or if it can be replaced with a revolutionary alternative. The difference between the two, third point, will be measured in millions of lives, if not billions. And last, a paraphrase of Karl Marx, you have nothing to lose but a figment of a future. You have a world to win. Unite. I even left time for questions. Students in my current classes know that this never happens, right? I usually just start talking and, you know, before I know it, I've used all the time.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. McIntyre. We do have like a little over 30 minutes for questions. So if people have them, you know, you can do the raise hand function. You can put them in the chat. Dr. Nast, you can kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I always like your principled pessimism because it's always politicized, so we can get alliterative. So I had some practical questions for you. Um, in terms of technologies, there's a contradiction, right, in terms of the actual footprint it takes to make these solar panels and the all electric vehicles and so on. So you had put in there in a list of things that were required, nuclear power plants. Just this is just thinking about Putin and Chernobyl and the way in which Ukraine has kind of set itself up with nuclear. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about how you see um, technological investments as somehow entrained into all this.
Yeah. So in the report I was using, Simon Michaud sort of threw in everything that wasn't fossil fuels, right? Because he was really asking a technical feasibility question. But any one of those kinds of power, they all have problems, right? So, nuclear power, right? Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, a massive waste disposal problem that isn't really even close to being solved yet, and truly massive amounts of concrete in their construction that, production of concrete is a major emitter of greenhouse gases itself, right? So, but you could do the same thing for solar power, right? And say, okay, well, what's in these panels, and where do the minerals come from, and where do we actually get those minerals now, and what are the conditions of production there? And the answer is they're all terrible, right? When you get to electric vehicles, for example, right, thinking about the scale of, so we're going to build all these electric vehicles, and they're all going to be battery powered, and we're going to use, lithium as a fundamental contributor to these batteries, unless we develop some new kind of battery technology. The figures on that, it looks like that alone would take up most of the world's stocks of lithium. And so, what was it? Was it late? All the recent years have just run together in my mind since COVID.
Well, I know that California, they're doing this hydrogen powered cars
Yeah.
that have actually been given the go ahead. And I can't remember the source of the technology. It's not US, maybe Japan.
Yeah.
Remember.
But in terms of the politics of lithium, right? I mean, we also already saw a coup d'etat in Bolivia, probably for its massive lithium reserves. And, that would just be conspiracy mongering if Elon Musk hadn't gotten on Twitter after it happened and said, we will coup whoever we want. So, yeah, I did it. What? Such are our captains of industries these days, right? So I don't think there's any technological fix. And there's a very recent book by Peter Gelderloos called The Solutions Are Already Here. But in chapter 2 of that book, he starts by sort of knocking down all of the solutions that were proposed in this report, right? Sort of looking at the downsides of all of them. For example, right? Remember when we had these discussions about sort of geomapping in Oaxaca many years ago? Yeah. Well, somebody finally did that, but it was the University of Kansas, and it was done in association with the Mexican government, and it was used as a tool of counterinsurgency. So,
which is why we chose not to do it. No, because we found out that the indigenous population didn't want us mapping their informal coffee groves because the state would use it to tax.
Yeah, I mean, GIS mapping is always going to make things legible in a certain way. And sometimes people have very good reasons for not wanting to be legible to powerful folks.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Mike, in terms of you talking about this kind of patchwork, like if you had to buy a car, uh, would you just say, not going to, I'm on a bicycle? Or, are there, what are the
Yes,
everyday,
I'm going to bicycle 40 miles one way to
right?
DePaul.
That's my point, right? That's my point. So in terms of these things, there's a picking and choosing, and it's not just about the individualist or the communalist. At some level, at the technological level, it's already kind of prefabbed, and we have to slot ourselves in.
Yeah,
So I'm just wondering, what would Mike
yeah.
McIntyre do?
Well, so there is something to be said for individually reducing our carbon footprints while still realizing that that's not going to solve the problem. So right now, I drive a 2014 Honda Civic Hybrid, um, and I plan to keep that for as long as it will run. And if I have to replace it, um, a number of things would come into play, right? I mean, currently my house isn't wired 220 volts or 240 volts, so charging a fully electric vehicle would be difficult. I'd have to think about that expense. But I'd also have to think about um, the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle, because about half of the fossil fuels used by a vehicle over its lifetime come during production,
Mhm.
right? So there's very much to be said for buying used cars in that sense, because then you've immediately cut out half of the emissions.
Right, and then you get to really bad gas mileage.
Well, it depends on what you buy, right? I mean, by now you can buy many, many varieties of used um, hybrid cars, and there, some electric vehicles have been on the market long enough that there's a used market there. Although, Consumer Reports tells me never to buy Tesla, so I don't plan to. Jolie, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be messy about even posing this question, but sort of, I really appreciated how you said that if there's going to be a solution, right? Like even preempting like technological development is like even building capacity for like action, like investment in those technologies, use of them, and like being a young person who has been to protests, like, yeah, it feels like solutions have become very performative. And actually, I hadn't thought about this prior, but even sort of the focus on climate change as like the main or even like sole disaster of our time, I think is linked to a lot of performative activism, just because it's so readily turned into, okay, so use a metal straw, use a this or that. And I mean, I'm from the coast of Southern California, and I had talked to people about the plastic mass in our Pacific Ocean that's the size of Texas, and people didn't know about it. And that was wild to me, but I probably only knew about it because I grew up at the Pacific Ocean and we did beach cleanup. So all of that is to say, preempting even the technology part, sort of just what do you think is the role of education and knowledge production and how that would happen? Because of course, state-led education is not doing it for us in science nor in history or in sort of any regard, but to even instill, and it's education to the end of producing certain social values that would say, hey, we all need to be acting around this right now. And I just want to end on the note again, this was not cleanly put, but I'm also in Professor Co's class right now that's economic inequality and political trauma. So thinking about the ways in which we not only don't have capacity to act, but some people are barred from having the capacity to act because of economic, social, environmental conditions of inequality. That's probably, you know, the people amongst us, people of color, being sort of the biggest leaders of activism in any given realm, probably also endure these conditions the most. So just on the note of interruption, how sort of discursive elements can play a role in that, as far as you know.
So let me make two comments. One is things go together and have to go together, right? For this to be possible. So the narrowing of focus to climate change, right? And the further narrowing of focus to certain fundamentally technocratic, capitalism compatible, quote unquote, solutions, right? So part of education has to be sort of smashing the idols, right? And for me, you know, given the politics of most people at DePaul, that means smashing liberal idols, right? Because, you know, there just aren't that many conservative students around. and to the extent there are, well, those aren't the people you'd be trying to reach anyway, right? So things like saying, you know, the Green New Deal, it's not enough, right? As opposed to let's all make Green New Deal signs and, you know, wave them at cars as they pass by. So there's that piece. And when I said all of these things have to go together, I also mean the different movements have to go together, right? So take the police and prison abolition movement, right? On the face of it, it doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with climate change. But if you are convinced that really radical solutions are needed, right? Then it would be a really good thing not to have a militarized police force to stand up against, right? And you sort of have to say, you know, let's not just think about what I think the best idea is, right? Let's look at places where people are actually facing extreme conditions and are acting in spite of it, right? And start from there, right? Rather than from our best really good idea. And then finally, educational institutions, right? What we really do now in universities is stamp, certify, and rank students for the labor market. Yeah? If we weren't doing that, for example, we wouldn't have to give grades. And there is no way that universities as institutions are going to do that as a matter of policy. Kaveh.
Thanks, Mike. Good to hear this talk again. You know, and you know, like previous times when you were kind of discussing this, you stayed away from kind of discussing, you know, paths of action and kind of solutions. And I wholly agree. I mean, you know, this is, you know, it's just kind of this day and age. I'm just reminded constantly of that sentence in the manifesto that, you know, solution is, it's either capitalism or barbarism, and we're like smack in the middle of barbarity, and we're just kind of plunging ahead. And
Well, Marx was wrong. We've got capitalism and barbarism.
Well, soon, I mean, I'm not sure if the wheels of capital, I mean, the way just looking at the supply chains and, like the one crisis after another, the labor force basically from one place to another decamping and becoming, refugees and, underclasses and, I mean, soon we're going to be facing a big, massive food crisis because of the, atrocities in Ukraine and all that. So, I'm not sure. The jury is still out on that. So let's wait on it before we kind of make a decision. But I think one point I would just add is, and it's important for us to kind of think about, is that the kind of the sense of crisis, I mean, like the material crisis that has brought about this, this environmental apocalypse, is the result of the lifestyle, the so-called middle class, bourgeois lifestyle of a pretty tiny portion of the world population. I mean, it's this is, we think that, oh, this is a relation, this is related to, population explosion and, like everybody's, but it's a consumption and the mode of life that kind of says that, all right, that expects electricity, a shower every day, to buy food at available, out of season at a, at the local drivable, grocery store, and to pay for it with money. And those are the expectations of middle class that we're all raised with, and universities are the factories for the production of this professional middle class and perpetuation of that. So I mean, I think we're also at the center of this institution that can actually politicize what it is producing. And I think one of the key things is our mode of consumption. It's the collective mode of consumption. I mean, that unless this is really kind of challenged, we're switching. And again, I'm in agreement. Like buying. I have a hybrid car too, but buying a hybrid car is leaves us exactly where we were. Living in buying the same kind of, I don't know, organic food is not, that doesn't make that much of a change. Or recycling, which recycling is a joke, because like 5% of what we kind of recycle is actually kind of recycled, through actually burning of fossil fuels, which is a requirement for transforming paper and plastics. Just like on this last note, in my extraction class, I haven't done that for a couple of years, but there was this Dutch guy, this environmental activist, who kind of like began with this experiment to instead of not using plastic, to kind of minimize his use of plastic. But then he decided to kind of store every single piece of plastic that he had consumed in his house, and then he began taking pictures of it after 1 year. And it's actually quite shocking, that you kind of like an environmental activist who just wants to recycle, that one. It's impossible. The kind of middle class lives that we live is nearly impossible, no matter how much you try through individual kind of reform or restraint to kind of curtail it. His house, he had this like rural house, was like overflowing with pieces of plastic, whether it be polyester clothing or Patagonia, jackets, or what have you. So I mean, I think it's that like this focusing on consumption, and also kind of like realizing that fundamentally our mode of life has to be kind of challenged and questioned is another like point. And the second thing is like the inequality of this, that this is like the vast majority of 150 million Bangladeshis are not contributing to this as much as Lincoln Park population is. There's that huge disparity.
Yeah, but Bangladesh is the country that's going to be underwater.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
but you know, once that population turns into refugees and boat people, then the militarization and finding, you know, raising walls and kind of actually deploying violence against them becomes, as we see with the refugee population, becomes the response.
and we know what will happen. It will be a bloodbath, right? I mean, think about where Bangladesh is, right? You've got a small border with Burma and a large border with India, right? Burma, which has already been expelling the Rohingya, right, is not going to accept a large wave of Muslim refugees. And India, which might have done that in the past, right? I mean, there was a large wave of refugees in 1970, 71, for example. The fascist government, right, of India, and the BJP is a fascist party, has already passed a law making it much more difficult for Muslims to stay in India, right? Muslims from outside India. So because Bangladesh is 80+% Muslim, India is not going to be an exit option either. Well, then what do you have? You know? And even before that, you know, I mean, before Bangladesh is underwater, we're going to see wet bulb temperatures go up. I mean, the heat wave that hit India and Pakistan just a week ago, right? I mean, you notice it's really, you know, hot here today. That's just the remnants, you know. And I don't know if the map I saw was wrong, but I could have sworn that on that map I saw certain small areas where the temperature was 60 degrees centigrade, which I think is 136 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, just unimaginably hot temperatures that you literally can't live in. So, so what does that mean? You know, it's like, well, you know, India, where are refugees from India going to go? You know, there is no bordering country that they can plausibly go to. Where do they go? And for refugees from Africa, we know what's going to happen, right? I mean, all of the horrible policies in the Mediterranean are going to be doubled and tripled down on. And the policy is going to be, okay, we are just going to pull up the drawbridges and put up the fences and say, okay, we can survive this because we're far enough north and we have enough money and we're just going to let you die. You know, I mean, that's really what we're looking at. And starting pretty soon.
Yeah.
So,
well, actually, I mean, you know, I've been giving, sorry, you know, I don't know if somebody else has their hands up or not, but this is not just about India. I mean, so UN and climate scientists have been doing this study of Indian Ocean and, Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. And there's this whole belt that, as you were mentioning, that is being predicted to become uninhabitable. And it's not just because of rising temperatures. Southern Iran is like, especially the Persian Gulf is, routinely 120 degrees, 55, 50 centigrade during especially July and all that. And, with the monsoon, right? But this is a combination of humidity and high temperature. So it actually makes biologically life impossible for that entire region. Now, what is interesting is that this is a region which also contains Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia and desalination plants and air conditioning and tallest buildings in the world, and a hub of global capitalism and a principal node of fossil fuel production, global trade, but labor migration, and also and modes of consumption. I mean, it's Las Vegas in in the Arabian Sea, right? So while it's becoming impossible to live, it's the most luxurious center of human inhabitation and a model that replaced. I mean, like just looking at the Middle East, I mean, that's interesting that Whereas 10 years ago, mere 10 years ago, we had the, you know, the Green Movement and, you know, the Arab Spring and all this like movements to kind of like reform politics and actually challenge authoritarianism, but also all these corrupt forms of politics. And now the model is that, you know, the model that replaced it through militarization is these authoritarian conservative monarchies that are hand in glove with, you know, the fossil fuel industry and militarism and Trumpism and, you know, US empire and all that. So I mean, you know, it's a
Yeah.
it's despairing too.
But it's like Las Vegas. If Las Vegas imported its entire working class from other countries, right? And their standard of living is you're living in a shipping container, right? So for example, you want heat deaths? I saw a news report the other day that thousands of people died of heat exhaustion, heat stroke, etc., in the construction of the stadiums for the World Cup in Qatar this year. You know? So, you know, if they'll do that for the World Cup, they'll do that for oil. Yeah. I mean, I just, once you've sort of seen the brutality, you know, and have sort of figured out that, you know, these people will do anything, then you just realize that, okay, so there is no firewall here, right? There's no point at which things just get so inhumane that everyone wakes up and decides to be good. Right? And you're right about consumption, right? And you know, even some of the things we do to like burn less fossil fuel, this is actually, I mean, this goes back to the Jevons paradox, right? That when you make fuel more efficient, you end up burning more of it, because when you can burn it more efficiently, its relative price goes down relative to other commodities, and therefore you consume more of it. Witness me. I get a hybrid car, and then what do? I move 40 miles away, right? Because I'm no longer driving. You know, a minivan that gets 15 miles to the gallon. I'm driving a hybrid that gets 45 miles to the gallon. So yay me, right? Except, you know, there it is. Jevons, the great capitalist economist of the 19th century, he had my number, right?
Thank you, Heidi, for sharing that link to Meredith. I didn't know that she'd done that. It's actually quite cool. I recommend people look it up.
Yeah, I better click on this now because otherwise I'll forget.
I wanted to also announce that, you know, I don't know, Tammy, sorry, Jolie, what you're doing with the newsletter or anything, but for those of you that had Temi Famadou as a student, you know, she's in UC Irvine, and I just got an email yesterday that she got one of these Mellon-funded Sawyer seminar grants for $25,000 for the year, and she was really stressed out about getting it. But it's Black Reconstruction as a Portal is the name of the overall project. So kind of like what you're doing, we're going to be reading some of the stuff on Fred Moten and you know, kind of looking at this theory that's not as rigid or driven by these objective categories that really don't contain much. If that makes sense. Anyway, I just wanted to give her a shout out while the faculty are here. I wish, Mike, that we could you know, have more conversations like this, because I feel like I could pick your brain in a lot more ways. You know, I wish we had I wish we had more times for faculty to come together.
Well, thanks to Jolie and other students who organized this. We already have this, so let's keep it going.
Yeah.
Yes, so I will jump
until
in.
the talk gets here.
Yeah, so I will jump in to say, I mean, yes, thank you so much, Dr. McIntyre, for kicking off this series, but definitely, I mean, there is such an advantage if you all as faculty think that you need more time to talk and get to know each other after I don't even know how many years you've all worked together, this is such a great value to us students who, tend to only have a few years to actually pick your brain somewhat. And really, there is so much knowledge there to be picked. I really look forward to next week's talk too by Dr. Nast. So all who are on the call, I shared the flyer that has the hyperlink Zoom, in-person attendance info. So please check that out. But if there are no more questions or any final comments, I will just reiterate once more, thank you, Dr. McIntyre. It's very prevalent discussion that you just led, and I can only ever say that when my mind is reeling, it's a good thing. So thank you.
Thank you, Jolie, for all the work you've done on this series.
And the posters are pretty bomb. I mean, those posters are super cool, Jolie. I don't know where you get those ideas, but thank you.
Thank you. Okay.